So our next presentation will be Grace Dietsch. She is the Director of Conservation for Rivers MetroParks, and she'll be presenting on some soil carbon data that we have project with the park. So let's welcome Grace.
Thank you. Do I have this positioned okay? Can you hear me? Is it good? Well, it's a special treat to present alongside Dr. Matthews, because he was one of the first people to hire me. He gave me one of my first field jobs like 20 years ago, sampling spotted salamanders and doing bird surveys in southeastern Ohio at one of the forests that he referenced in his talk. So this is really special. Before I get started on the presentation, I want to call out a couple of our project partners. So we worked with a consultant called EcoTalk. They're based out of Indianapolis. And so while we came up with the idea that we needed to do a soil carbon study, through working with EcoTalk, I knew that one of their senior consultants had done this kind of project before. And so he really worked closely alongside us to do the field sampling and put us in contact with the Natural Areas Conservancy, which is a nonprofit based out of New York, who provided us with the overarching protocol and a lot of the equations that we used, that Lisa used to do a lot of the analysis. So they were major project partners on this. So I'm going to go just very high level. So carbon cycle, greenhouse effect, these are all very complex systems. I'm going to give a very high level overview just so we're all kind of on the same energy wave as we move through the presentation. Looking at the first stage of the carbon cycle, so we'll say the carbon, so it enters the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And we'll say through this mechanism, so as soon as soil is disturbed, that carbon is released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And we'll say for this purpose, it was extracted as fossil fuel, released into the atmosphere through industrialization, and now it's CO2. So that CO2 is then absorbed by plants and converted back into carbon. And there's lots of different things that can happen to that carbon. It can be stored in that plant, it can get stored into the soil, through that plant, or it can get consumed. Oh no. Okay. I immediately look at Lisa. Or it's consumed by animals, or us, we're animals too. So, and then ultimately, that carbon enters the soil through the process of decomposition, or like I said, through other mechanisms. So, and then that process starts back over again. Again, very high-level overview. And of course, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. There are many other greenhouse gases that cause this greenhouse effect, this global warming effect. And there's many other different mechanisms that give us all of these greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. I thought this was a really cool image to kind of put it in perspective of the composition of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere and also the major contributors. And I think this is also an interesting way to look at, we always hear that, eating less meat is better for the environment. It's a great way to kind of reduce your footprint. Think of all the different ways, that meat package is touched in this diagram through, how it was transported, how it was processed. So this is a really great way to look at that. So greenhouse gases, these are natural occurrences in our atmosphere. Right? This is a natural process. This is what makes our environment a livable space. That keeps that heat reflected back into our immediate climate area, so it makes plants grow. So they're a good thing, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So excess amounts of greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere traps too much heat. That heat is then reflected back into our livable space, which causes that greenhouse effect, that global warming effect. And Dr. Matthews had a very similar graph, but this is the increase in our global temperatures over time. This is land and ocean combined. And as you can see, there between like kind of the 1900s, there was a natural increase. There was a natural trend of our climate warming. But right about the industrial age, it it really started to increase exponentially, and we're not slowing down. And thinking more locally here in Dayton, so I gleaned this information from the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission. They put together a very large document called the Priority Climate Action Plan. There's lots of really cool data in that. So, and they probably got a lot of this information from the Miami Conservancy District. And so what they've been finding that, so over the past several years, this is just over the past several years here in Dayton, that we're on average about a temperature, 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature over time, over the course of a year. That highest temperature increase, we're seeing that of 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit in springtime. So we're having warmer springs. We're having higher nighttime temperatures. We're experiencing fewer colder days overall throughout the year. Almost a 30% increase in annual precipitation, with the highest precipitation occurring in the fall, up almost 3.8 inches, which is a pretty substantial amount. And of course, I don't think anybody would argue with that we're experiencing more frequent and more severe storms every year. So we know all this information, and you know, MetroParks, we know we're also an important carbon sink for our area, for the Miami Valley. And we wanted to be proactive, and so we wanted to really focus and prioritize our climate change leadership and our climate change mitigation efforts. And so we made it one of our 3 areas of focus within our strategic plan. And so being on that team, I decided that we should really kind of put a focus on understanding what our carbon sink is. And we will also be figuring out what our emissions are, because we put the initiative together. We wanted to make sure that we are a carbon negative agency. So the first step in that was to determine, you know, how are we doing on carbon sequestration? How are we doing on carbon storage? And that's where the soil study came into play. And again, I kind of know that this consultant with EcoLogic had done this before, so he helped me put this together. So we selected 54 data points for soil samples at each point. And we couldn't just simply sample a bunch of different forests. I really wanted to break it down to do as many comparisons as we possibly could to help us really answer, you know, any additional questions that we might have as restoration practitioners. You know, so being able to compare, you know, carbon sequestration, carbon storage function across various habitat types could allow us to further, you know, prioritize our restoration efforts, allow us to prioritize our limited resources that we do have to make a greater impact. And we hand selected the best habitat types throughout the district at these various park locations. So when thinking about which habitat types we were sampling in, we wanted to make sure we were picking the best representatives that we could find. So the picture on the left is a representative of what our floodplain forests look like. So floodplain forests are riparian areas, so thinking along waterways, predominantly occupied by, you know, larger trees, cottonwoods, sycamores. You know, they've been largely undisturbed, so the soil there has been largely undisturbed because, you know, probably wasn't as accessible when, you know, 90% of Ohio's forests were cleared back in the early 1800s. And it's also got a higher water table in general. So the next picture on the right, so that is your high quality forest. So high quality forests are characterized by really cute kids. Monica was drinking that one. And also very large mature trees. In our area, large mature oak trees, hickory trees, very little invasive species in the understory. The next picture over, you got your medium quality forest. So some larger trees, but mostly medium-sized trees. You're starting to see some invasive species in the understory, but you can still, you know, see for far distances. Much unlike the picture on the very right-hand side, where that's Lisa in the background 10 meters away, you can hardly see her through all of the invasive species. So to compare wetlands, on the very left-hand side, it's woodland fen, which fens stay wet, you know, almost year-round. Actually, not almost, they're wet year-round. Spring run, so emergent wetland, devoid of trees, open water, and then forested wetland. I couldn't for the life of me remember where that picture was taken from. I don't even think it's a metro park, so I didn't bother trying to label it. And then prairies, and the quality of prairies is kind of indicated by time since restoration for this effort. So the picture on the left is Spring Run Conservation Area. That's that's first year growing season prairie, so not a whole lot of diversity. Roots are barely getting established. To compare it with the prairie like Huffman Prairie, which is a very high quality remnant prairie that's been established for a really long time. And so looking at methods, so we established 10 meter circle plots at each of those 54 sampling points. We did establish permanent center markers in the field, so if we wanted to go back through and replicate this study again, we can. We ID'd and measured all trees that fell within within that circle. We estimated the understory herbaceous cover, as well as native and non-native cover, and we ran that meter tape at north, south, east, west intercepts. Any downwoody debris, like what hit that tape, we would measure the length, the diameter, ID it to species if we could, and record that information as well. So aside from measuring downwoody debris, all of the plant information was collected solely by the consultant. He's one of the foremost botanists in our area, and so for consistency purposes, he handled all of the plant identification and all the recording of that information. Our team was responsible for that woody debris and also wielding that lovely tool, which is the soil hammer, to extract all of the that fond memory, to extract all of the soil pores, one taken which within each of the 4 quadrants, and the soil core was about 12 inches deep. And this is just a small sampling of the equations that were provided to us. If you have questions about this, Lisa will be standing by with bated breath, ready to explain them further to you. But essentially, we calculated, we sent the soil samples off. There was over 220 soil samples. This is a very specialized type of soil analyzation. It was sent to a soil lab, New Jersey Rutgers Soil Laboratory. Did the analysis for us. What I wanted to highlight here was something that kind of along the lines of what Dr. Matthews was pointing out as far as how species specific, certain parameters are. And so each species that fell within our plot was assigned a coefficient that was predetermined by researchers that kind of developed, contributed to this protocol. But there were species-specific coefficients that took into consideration, how fast those species grow, things of that nature, and their habitat type, and so all that was factored in. Especially relevant when you're thinking about carbon sequestration over time and how fast those species grow, because that fluctuates over time. And so now we can get to the results. And so this is just soil carbon. So this is carbon being stored in the soil. And the unit of the measurement here is going to be different than the other graph you're going to see. This is megagrams of carbon per hectare. The next graph you're going to see is tons of carbon per acre, but the trend is going to be the same. So just letting you know that in advance. And we are starting to see a lot of overlap in our comparisons. And this was true for the soil carbon stock. This also was true for some of our sequestration information, as well as our biomass, our tree carbon stock. So we ended up grouping these habitat types just to make our analysis a little bit simpler moving forward. And so here's our total carbon stock density. So taking a look at the soil first, you can see that the 3 habitat types that predominantly have wetter soils store the most carbon. Does anybody know why that is? So in soils that are wetter, have largely anaerobic conditions, so not a whole lot of oxygen in very wet soils, that slows down that decomposition process. So that allows those soils to store much higher levels of carbon. So that explains why we've got much greater carbon storage in those wetter soils. And then looking at the live tree carbon stock density, no surprise, a high quality forest store much more carbon as well as our floodplain forests, which we picked some really great floodplain forests, Germantown, Taylorsville, massive trees. So much bigger differences there. And of course, your low and medium quality forests, those trees aren't matured, they're not dying, there's not a whole lot of standing dead timber there, which also is a good carbon store. And so they're looking at carbon sequestration. So I'll make this a little bit more tangible on some of the other slides. So the next step was to calculate this sequestration. And so you can see a high quality forest, there's only 437 acres of high quality forests throughout our district, which is about 5% roughly of our total forested acres, but it contributes to about 10% of our carbon sequestration, which is pretty substantial. So thinking about that more tangibly, over 600,000 tons of carbon per year, removing over 2.2 million tons of carbon dioxide annually. So that's equivalent to taking, almost 500,000 gasoline-powered vehicles off the roads every year, or 275,000 homes, offsetting those emissions, which is a little bit more than all the homes that occur in Montgomery County, which is pretty neat. And then thinking about green energy, so we know, wind turbines, they do not have those greenhouse gas emissions. So the amount of carbon dioxide removed by your 5 Rivers MetroParks forests is equivalent to about 600 wind turbines running for an entire year, which is about the size of the largest wind turbine farm, which is located in California, which is a nice comparison. Very substantial. So again, looking at Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, some of the work they did, and I just thought this was another kind of a neat comparison to help wrap our heads around this information. They put together all of the industrial sectors of the carbon, so this is carbon dioxide, again. Looking at residential and some of the other sectors, they estimated that, at least in 2021, that there was over 11 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions every year. So the 5 Rivers MetroParks properties and the forests are sequestering around 20% of those emissions annually. And then kind of thinking about that on a smaller scale. So an acre, 78 tons of carbon per year, 286 tons of carbon dioxide annually. So about 61 cars, 35 homes, offsetting emissions for either one of those. And then also, again, thinking about green alternatives, that's like diverting almost 92 tons of waste from the landfill through recycling efforts. So again, this is all very, this is all brief, it's an overview, it's complicated, and trees, they cannot do it all. And it's highly variable. So think about all this information as kind of a snapshot. It's much more complicated than that. So, thinking about, the issues we face on a national level, there's some research out there that says the United States would need to plant around 74 million acres of forest every year to meet our carbon emission needs, to help slow down some of these trends that we've been looking at. Another complication of this is that carbon sequestration varies. Like I said before, it varies by species, by the size of the tree, by the age of the tree. So sequestration is facilitated by photosynthesis. And so the older the tree gets, especially as they really start to mature, which, for some of the oak trees, that can be in a couple hundred years or 400 years, their sequestration slows down. So that means forests can ultimately reach kind of a maturity level and reach equilibrium. And then, unfortunately trees, large amounts of trees can die very quickly. So that happens in forest fires. Carbon is released into the atmosphere like that. And in some parts of Ohio even, where there's still clear-cutting forests, and of course everybody hears about cutting down rainforests. That's a huge impact when thinking about some of our global sequestration issues. And of course, if we needed another reason to hate invasive species, we have one. They do not sequester carbon. They do not do the heavy lifting like some of our native species do. And in fact, they impede our ability, our forest's ability to really function at a high level because it slows down that forest regeneration process. Some of that picture I showed you of that low quality forest, you know, that forest is gonna have a really hard time maturing, looking like some of those forests that I showed you in Germantown and that floodplain forest because of invasive species. And without intervention, it may never get there. But all this to say, it really points to the importance of urban forests and lands like metroparks, like especially fiber. But I'm biased. So this data set was included in a study. It was included in a study alongside 8 other metropolitan areas. I'm talking Chicago, Seattle, St. Louis. I can't think of the rest of them, but I can give you a copy of the PDF of the publication if you're interested. And they evaluated similar protocol, looking at over 1,800 plots. They found that just over 55% of carbon was stored in the above ground biomass, which jives with what we found in our study. And again, carbon storage increased with your proportion of native plants. Carbon density, they found, which I thought this was really interesting, they found that carbon sequestration, carbon storage is higher in urban forests than in rural forests because urban forests had larger trees and higher percent of native trees. And I grew up in southeastern Ohio where we did have kind of more rolling forests, but I guess that doesn't occur in all areas, especially in some of those more metropolitan areas. But overall, their trend was across the country that was the case, which really highlights the importance of forest preservation. Above all, conserve what we have. You know, so that's applicable in your own yards too. Not only conserving what you have, but improving what you have, but also helping organizations like Five Rivers, or whatever organizations you're most interested in that helps with forest conservation. And anything we can do to continue to invest in invasive species management is also crucial. So with that, I want to give a big shout out to Lisa, who not only helped with a lot of the analysis, but also helped put together these graphs and keep me on the straight and narrow and encourage me along the way. And which is great support, great partner in putting all those together. And then Megan, Sarah, Kevin, Nicole, Ben, 3 of them are in the audience here. They did the heavy lifting when it comes to wielding that tool, which literally shattered at the last sampling plot. And it was being held together by duct tape and glue and threads, and it was the worst tool in the world, but we made it work and we made it happen. So I'm super proud of that team amongst some of the other partners. Happy to try and answer any questions. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. One of the last things you said, carbon storage. Let's see. So invasives don't sequester as much carbon. Why is that? Is it because they're smaller, like understory things, or I mean, I just can't figure out why that. Do you know why that would be?
My guess would be that they're smaller in size.
Okay.
They do not grow to nearly the size and scale. And Dr. Matthews, feel free to jump in at any point in time. But
That's just so interesting because it's like they still, they're still growing. So they're still part of the thing.
yeah, it's not that they don't contribute anything.
Sure.
Even
Yeah.
turf grass contributes something to,
Right.
know,
Oh, maybe it's the
But-
root system. It just makes me want to look it up. So,
I was gonna say,
yeah.
from what I remember from a study that we had heard about previously from one of our partners, university-wise, I think it's because the microbes and other stuff that breaks down in the soil can't necessarily tolerate like the differences in chemicals and stuff like that.
Okay.
So it doesn't break down as easily
Okay.
or as well, and it doesn't contribute properly.
That makes so much sense. Thanks.
So when you're doing the sample, you're just taking a snapshot, looking at the amount of carbon at the soil at that time.
Mhm.
How does that then translate into like sequestration per year?
sequestration is facilitated by trees. And so that will fluctuate over the course of time. Carbon storage, if I understand it correctly, which again, I have learned a ton by doing this study. No pun. So carbon storage will accumulate over time, very slowly, through the process of decomposition, through more carbon being stored over time. So we would expect it to increase through all those processes. At what rate, I have no idea. That's why we established permanent center points at each of these sampling points to go back maybe 5 years or something like that, to try and learn more, because to my knowledge, this hasn't really been studied very well in our particular area, and every climate is different, and so every forest, every climate is going to function differently.
On some of the data that you presented, you were talking in terms of annual sequestration rates.
That is definitely a snapshot in time,
Okay.
because that will depend on weather,
Right.
that depends on greenhouse gas emissions. You know, I was looking at this publication that came out, that I can send to anybody who's interested in. You know, some of the sequestration rates were just just off the charts. And I'm thinking to myself, like, why is that? You know, we have such a huge land base, and then I'm thinking, like, well, the carbon emissions, you know, close to Seattle just must be huge. And so all that is very variable depending on how much of carbon the trees are sequestering. It's fascinating stuff. There's so many cool rabbit holes. Any other questions?
So the different sites that you were, I mean, that was neat though that you got to that many representative kind of places here. I mean, so you mentioned the one was about 5%. You said of the kind of that was the mature types of forest.
The high quality forest,
High quality
yeah.
forest, yeah. Like so, what in general, like for those other ones that had these maybe larger carbon pools, like how do those broke down? Like what is the majority of your land? I guess I should.
Majority of our land is by far the low medium quality forest.
Yeah, and so like that. I mean, so is there like that component of as through time you would be motivated to kind of see those transition right through, and is there any way like to start to get back of the envelope of pieces of how that could look, right? Of how much gain sequestration you could have by year? Have you looked at that yet?
Yeah. You know, so are you thinking like how we would use this information to
to
inform our
make
land
decisions.
management strategies? Yeah. You know, so what we would do with this would be to kind of look at these high quality forest areas and kind of work out from there. How can we further protect those buffer areas? Because those, we would have, you know, those kind of low, medium quality areas adjacent to those high quality forest areas, because they're little remnants, little pockets that are protected probably because of topography that again couldn't be deforested back in the day. And then kind of just looking at, you know, what our canopy cover is and prioritizing based on, you know, where we're most likely to see oak, hickory, forest regeneration if we were to help, you know, keep invasive species out of the understory, out of the subcanopy, to allow that more natural regeneration to occur, which is going to then help perpetuate, you know, invasive species suppression, and will get the most bang for our buck that way.
So I think that goes back to the question, like a snapshot through time, but we know that certain trees will sequester carbon at a different rate, especially when they're released some from competition, right? And so that, I mean, to me, that's how I see it fitting into like how you take the snapshot to infer like a longer term success. So,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. Good thoughts.
What is next? How about the soil studies wrapped up?
Next, we're putting a lot of energy and focus into determining our emissions for our agency. We still need to really look at that. Aside from that, Lisa and I really want to put some focus on getting this information published so that other folks can reference this, access this data set within the scientific community, so perhaps it can help others. And then also just kind of thinking about this strategically to help inform, you know, our land management strategies, just exactly in that way that Dr. Matthews referenced. Good question.
We get into like species of trees that are best at storing carbon and like the numbers we have of each.
Is that in the raw data?
Yeah, for the plots. Yeah, we can probably get that from the plots. We have a big Excel with all the species, all their DPH, all their sizes, which was used in those formulas with those coefficients to figure out.
tulip trees, the big ones that do really, really well, but you may not have as many of those. We've had more sugar maple instead.
Yeah, now we gotta look at the tree alleys.
Right?
No.
There's a table for me.
Yeah.
Guys.
Which I've already seen, I saw your presentation before, and it's still just as fascinating as the first time I saw
How sweet gum do.
it. Any other questions for myself or Dr. Matthews that you thought of? Yeah?
Are you ever going to do any citizen science or letting volunteers help with any of this? I mean, I know this part is over, but was that something that you guys did? I live adjacent to Possum Creek, and I'm like, oh my god, if I could go take a soil sample there, I would just die of happiness. So
I have some maps for you.
Okay.
The bags are in my car.
I have
the maps with, I'll get them all to you.
opportunity, or I know you guys got the big grant to remove invasives and
Yeah.
things like that, so I just didn't know. I'm sure that if it is, you guys will publicize it. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I'm already like, research at MetroParks, like, definitely wrote that down, so.
Yeah. Looking at soil sampling, so there's some conservation leaders seated behind you. They helped kick off some soil sampling as a part of that grant project, where I wanted to just do some pH sampling, some soil sampling in some of the areas within that grant project where I knew we wanted to do some habitat transitions. I also want to go back to take that a step further to do more environmental soil testing to look for legacy pollution and things like that. So kind of a two-step process. So if you're interested in that topic,
Any and all of that, yes.
it's been a lovely audience.